I'm really pleased to be here today to speak. The sub judice, Martin Darcon's been on my back to speak here for about 3 years, and I really haven't had the opportunity to do it until now. And it's great to be here to see you all. It's a lovely venue, and I need to extend my thanks to both Martin and Sarah and the organisers for corralling my sort of rather wayward preparation. The OAA has got used to it, guys. I do turn up and speak eventually. My brief this morning is to sort of give you a bit of an insight into my world. The idea is to introduce you to national grade, sort of weapons grade research, if you like, in a way that you would find meaningful and relevant to your practice. I'm not going to be teaching you how to do trials, but today what I want to let you know about is the structures that exist nationally to support trials, and how you as front-line workers can access those, should you so wish. So is obstetric anaesthetic research important? Is clinical research important? Well, of course I think it's important. I'm a university employee. I'd be out of a job if we don't do it. Okay. But is it important to you, and is it important to our profession? Well, I think it is, and I think it's important because if we are to continue to develop and not do the same things that we were doing 20 years ago, we need to be looking ahead into the future, developing, testing, proving or disproving new products, new initiatives, and new clinical implementation and intervention issues. How do we actually know whether research is working in anaesthesia? Well, this was the last attempt by John Hartman and Ian Moppet from Nottingham, which was a bibliometric analysis, and a little bit old now, 2011, but it was a look at how we were doing nationally in terms of our publication citations as a specialty. And on the face of it, it didn't seem too bad. About 1,500 papers over 2 years, lots of subsequent citations on the index, and 46 institutions represented. The devil really was in the detail, because if you look hard, over 50% of those publications came from 4 places. And to sow a little Yorkshire discord here across the audience, Leeds was one of them, and Sheffield sadly wasn't. So work to do for me there. Looking at it in a different way, this is data from the National Institute of Health Research, and I'll come on to explain who they are later. And this is an analysis of all specialties in England now, and the number of, if you like, studies which are sponsored by them in comparison to the number of consultants in a given specialty. So if you look right at the top, hepatology has about 36 studies for 31 consultants. Now these are national studies. And look who came last. Right. That's not to dishearten you, it's just to give you an idea of where we stand nationally. And the NIHR were typically damning with their faint praise when they said, we have plenty of scope for doing more. So coming back to how research is structured and where we should be going with this, I like to go back to John Herbert Dillinger, who rather had a short but explosive life around about the sort of Great Depression. And he was famously asked after being finally caught, why he robbed banks? And his response was, that's where the money was. Okay. National research, like a lot of things, is now about funding streams, and there's no getting away from it. And I'll come on to talk about why that's important to your trusts in a moment. The funding bodies basically boil down into a number of very discrete silos, if you like. There's Wellcome, which doesn't have a great deal to do with anaesthesia, because that's very basic science, although some of the MH work in Leeds is supported by it. There's MRC, and then there's the National Institute of Health Research, which I'll come on to in a minute. National charities, including some of our subspecialty organisations, are now punching their weight as well. This, if you like, is the NIHR work pathway. This is how it's supposed to happen. That someone gets an invention, it's evaluated properly, and then there are trials about whether that should be adopted, and then there is a diffusion into national practice and guidelines. And this was enshrined in an encyclical called Better Quality, Better Value, and Better Health, which is, I think, about 8 years old. Part of that was the idea of something called a managed research translational pathway. The idea you get an idea or a new product, and you rip it right the way through to the patient bedside, supporting that at every point with evidence, or rejecting it, saying, no, this isn't any better, or it's too expensive, or it's not doing the job that we want. And if I'm an expert in anything, which that nice bio kind of summarised, that's the bit that I work on, which is clinical trials, mostly late clinical trials, looking at clinical effectiveness, so-called applied health research. Does this stuff work in the real world with real people? Boiling it right down for you, and not trying to dumb it down too much, roughly speaking, it's the MRC's job to find out whether something can work. It's the NIHR mechanism section job to find out, does it work? And it's my job with the HDA to find out whether it's worth it. So here's the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research. It was founded in 2006, and it was like a conglomeration, a dragging in all the research funding streams that were fairly kind of granular and participatory and are a bit disparate all the way across the nation. They're all pulled in on the Department of Health Control. So you've got a research governance and research funding structure. You have lots of local clinical research networks, which I'll come and explain in a minute, which are bits that are relevant to you. And there's also an NIHR faculty. Those are people retained on Department of Health money, of whom I am one, whose job it is to disseminate research, to actually go and get grants, and to make trials happen. Roughly speaking, for you and I, as practicing anaesthetists, and I am a real live anaesthetist, I do labour suite sessions and everything, there are one or two funding streams of the NIHR which are highly relevant to us. The ones that I think you should be aware of as practicing clinicians are the health technology assessment funding stream. And this is, if you like, the boiler house. This is where trials get commissioned, funded, and done. And the new kid on the block, which I think is particularly relevant for us, is so-called health services and delivery research. And this is an amalgamation of two previous streams. But this, for anaesthesia, is right where we should be. This is a stream which is supporting the way patients flow through hospitals, whether multiple innovations can make that better, and looking very wide across the patient journey. So not only in theatre. Okay. This is the only assessment slide I'll show you. This is to give you an idea of when you actually apply for research, how you are assessed. You apply to the NIHR through a series of panels. And you go through an increasingly rigorous set of, if you like, funding gates. Having sat on one of these panels, I can tell you that they're brutal, fairly Darwinian, but rigorously fair. They are anonymised, and often it is the ideas from the very shop floor which resonate with these panels most acutely. Yeah? They like interventions which are NHS relevant and patient specific. Wrapping back a bit, this is the stuff which is really relevant to individuals at individual hospitals. Some of you will have heard of this thing called the portfolio. Yeah. The portfolio is important. It's important for you and it's important for me. And this is a nationally anchored, if you like, resource for trials. So any trial or any study, even if it's not, even if it's observation, that gets elected to the portfolio is automatically eligible for national support and your local CLRN support. If you look again across national portfolio studies by specialty, it won't come as a surprise to you that the top dogs are cardiovascular, musculoskeletal and respiratory. We don't do too bad. I know that looks a bit menial, but we're right there with surgery. And there is a current national initiative to promote perioperative medicine and surgical trials. The importance for you at a local level is that the whole portfolio is governed by something called the UK Clinical Research Council Board. And in turn, that is split down into national bodies. The NIHR is ours in England. And our local body for the whole of Yorkshire and Humber is called our CRN. Now, importantly, if you have a portfolio study, the CRN is obliged to give you support, real life support, resource, people, management, infrastructure. Okay. So if your study is portfolioed, this immediately kicks in. That means it's very important for you and me to know how you get portfolio. NIHR funding is an open door into it, but importantly there are also so-called non-commercial partners which are funded or allocate or set aside the NIHR, which gives you that status. The really big news, the crucial news for you and me, is that all these organisations are portfolio partners. Now what that means, in real life terms, is if you guys go and get a grant from the AGBI, or indeed the OEA, even for £2,000, that funding is automatically matched by at least that resource or greater in your trust, and they're obliged to do so. Okay. You should get research nurse time, you should get infrastructure support, you should get data management support, and data capture. Okay. So is it all about the money? Well, sadly, there is a lot of economic and fiscal science to this. Is there a downside? Unfortunately, yes. If you're not portfolioed and don't trigger that resource support, your trust is likely to regard your study or your service valuation as merely overhead. In other words, they don't have to give you any love, if you see what I mean. They're not obliged to do so, and that can make actually conducting studies, especially for busy clinicians, incredibly challenging. So, if you actually want to go out and do some research, how do you do it from a very practical point of view? How do you get your message across? Well, this is a good place to start. This is where funding bodies want to see you working in evidence gaps, in places where we really don't know, where there is genuinely clinical uncertainty. Identify your research question early on and try and define it. And try and look at the remit. Who are you going to go to for funding, and is it their bag to give you money? All right. And if you can define your research question with clarity early and get that message across, you're really streets ahead. Research design can be a bête noire for people who have not had formal training in it, but there is an enormous amount of support out there. Most clinical trials units and all trusts have something called research design services, which are available to you for free. You can take your ideas to them early, and if you're prepared to receive constructive criticism, they will actually help you not only raise an application, but they will help you redefine your question. Okay. They'll also help you look at feasibility. Can you recruit? What will be your recruitment retention? What sort of numbers are you going to project? And I would urge you, if at all possible, to look outside theatre. Not exclusively outside theatre, but look beyond the confines of your theatres, into the sort of the perioperative stream. Look for outcomes which are meaningful to people who perhaps aren't as cognizant of or au fait with the things that concern us in anesthesia. Pick your team. And there is a bit of a name game to play here, guys. So you need a multidisciplinary team. If at all possible, second someone who's experienced research. Come and bang on my door in Sheffield. Right. I work at an Applied Health Research Institute at Sheffield University. It's got 300 people across a range of specialties. Clinical trials experts, clinicians, medical statisticians. And they have the resource to give you this sort of input. If at all possible, go to someone with a track record for funding. It does help. And play the name game. Now, this is something that you may not yet have heard of, and this is very, very relevant for us as researchers now, patient-public involvement. The idea being that research should not only be for patients, but directed alongside and with patients. That consumer representation is now almost mandatory for us to engage with very, very early. and we should be looking at patient-centered outcomes right from the point of study design, even to the point of having patients as study collaborators. And this PPI initiative is inescapable now in research. Where do you get access to this PPI resource? Well, it is out there. And there is a burgeoning level of PPI, if you like, ports of call. National specialty groups offer it. Some charities like NCT, which I know can be a double-edged blade. I've had very good experience with NCT and supported some of my studies. And there is now a national body sponsored by and funded by the National Institute of Health Research called Involve. Interestingly, at Sheffield we also have a local organisation called Jessop's PPI who give of their time freely to look at our research applications, criticise them, and they're invaluable. Cost your study. Get someone to cost your study. Do it properly. Cost your time in. If you cost your time, you can take it to your clinical director and say, there's external funding for my 2 hours a week or my research PA. There is national precedent for this. It works. Be honest and be realistic, and be ambitious. Don't undersell yourself. There is money sitting out there, especially in the OAA pots and research for patient benefit pots, which is going begging and not being allocated, even in these tight fiscal times, because the quality of applications coming in is not sufficient for people to give that money over confidently. Part of convincing a funder that you can not only do the study, is doing some sort of deliverability assessment. Okay. Show them, either in a pilot study or by just showing the numbers across your centres, that you can actually do this. Get some sample size estimates from someone who knows their way around a chi-square test. All right? And identify, if you can, up front, sites where you're going to actually do the work, if it's multi-centre. There is a bit of showmanship to this involved. You do have to sell your product. All right? So that's all the sites. There is a salesman issue here. Well, the key is write it well, and write it to someone who is, if you like, intelligent, scientifically literate, but not necessarily an anaesthetic expert. Yeah. So, I'm not going to teach you how to do randomised trials. I haven't got time. But is there such a thing as a typical randomised trial supported by the HTA, the boiler room, if you like? Well, of course there's not. It's a spectrum. And all trials reside on a spectrum of size, ambition, outcomes. But this is, roughly speaking, the kind of mean or median size trial. It can be anything between about 700 individuals, but anything up to hundreds of thousands of those are very, very big. They're multidisciplinary, they're often multi-centre. And you're looking at not only clinical effectiveness, but increasingly cost effectiveness of an intervention. And that means dragging in experts in health economics. Most trials now are explicitly pragmatic. In other words, we realise that the gold standard, double-blind, placebo, randomised controlled trial is extremely difficult to conduct in the clinical milieu. Therefore, there are compromises to be made, and real-world trials are cut and square. Okay. The relevance for that is, although they may sacrifice some methodology, when you actually come on to try and project them out into national practice, it is much more easy to adopt. Does that make sense? Yeah. If you look at the outputs, where these trials end up being published, in terms of impact, if you get funded by these organisations, you're talking about British Medical Journal, Lancet, and if possible, New England Journal, if you're lucky. So that's not bad. Not bad at all. We're trying to punctual that. To give you 3 examples, these are 3 trials, coming to almost the end of the speech now. These are 3 trials I've been directly involved in as either chief investigator or a chief clinical investigator. BUMPS, which has now concluded, was a study of position in second stage of labor in women who already had an epidural in place. It was a nationally commissioned piece of work. In other words, this was the Department of Health coming to UK investigators and saying, we want an answer to that question, in that if we manipulate position in the second stage can alter delivery. You go into open competition with these commissions, and you vie against other units. And it's usually a 3-stage process to actually get right down to the money. The research model, fortunately, we were fortunate enough to be successful. The research model was very ambitious. It was a national multi-centre randomised controlled trial. Eventually, we included 41 units and recruited over 3,000 patients over a 3-year period. That seems expensive, doesn't it? That's about average. Roughly speaking, for a multidisciplinary trial, you're talking between £1,000 and £1,500 per patient. And the consumption of that resource, believe you me, is not in my salary, no matter what you might think. The most expensive thing in conducting trials is people. Research nurses, research midwives, their time, their efforts. And there is also a large resource implication for research infrastructure. Actually having the infrastructure to deploy and have governance of 41 sites is an immensely sort of intense, financially intense process. This was a very pragmatic trial. Women who were single-term cephalic and at term and had an epidural and entered second stage of labour were randomised to either upright positions or lying down positions. The reason this is important is that a Cochrane review conducted in 2011 demonstrated that women without epidurals who were randomised to these positions, if they had an axial position, actually had a higher chance of delivering vagina. We were powered at 90%, which is de rigueur now. Sorry guys, it used to be 80%. It's now 90%. Okay. That means more patients. And hopefully we'll be reporting at the end of this year. We completed our last recruit in January 2014. They're all followed up for a year afterwards. So we're now at the stage of data cleaning and data crunching. This is another trial for which I'm chief investigator for. This is currently undergoing. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is called SALVO, which is a UK national study investigating cell salvage in caesarean section in women at risk of war. Again, multi-centre, 21 centres this time. Another 3,000 recruits. Seems to be other trials with 3,000 recruits. Who knew? It's pragmatic in design and slightly cheaper this time. There's no magic to that. It was just a slightly different design in terms of the way we actually deploy out nationally. And this trial was precipitated by the clinical uncertainty which has resulted from the rapid adoption of intraoperative self-salvage in caesarean section by most of our units without any real evidence base for its effectiveness. There is only one trial that's ever been conducted apart from SALVO in this context. Lots of observational work, and that one trial had only 56 recruits. Women are randomised if they have a risk of bleeding during caesarean section to cell salvage or usual care, which is donor blood transfusion. And our primary outcome is exposure to allergenic blood. So, remember me talking to you about real-world endpoints? Excuse me. This is easy to sell. Okay? Do you get donor blood or not? Makes sense to a committee. It makes sense to a committee of lay people and non-anaesthetists. Now, for the anaesthetist, there are many, many secondary outcomes which we are fascinated with. Do we reduce blood transfusion? What happens to haemoglobin fall? How about time to mobilisation? Postnatal quality of life? Is it cost effective to introduce cell salvage into a unit? Yeah. Those should all come out from this work, but these are secondary outcomes. And last of all, this is the trial that's currently consuming most of my efforts, called Respite, which is supported by my NIHR fellowship. And it's a randomised controlled trial of remifentanil intravenous PCA versus intramuscular pethidine in labour. Now, I haven't got hollyhocks here. And I understand that the meeting previously had a presentation from Professor Sneed in Southampton, who managed to scare the bejesus out of everyone about remifentanil. So I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not a remifentanil tub thumper, but what I am trying to do is evaluate remifentanil as an intervention. So it's a randomised control. Oh, by the way, I'm very grateful to Professor Sneed because he told me to order the study, which was great. You know, so it's the old adage. There is no such thing as bad publicity. So a randomised trial, it's smaller in scale, multi-centre, open label study. Everyone knows what the intervention is, so both participants to the study and clinician know the randomisation allocation. It's something called a CTIP, which is a controlled trial of an interventional medicinal product or drug. And those are the ones that give you sleepless nights. Because you not only have to comply with all the ethical infrastructures that your MREC gives you, there's an organisation which you'll be familiar with called the MHRA, who breathe down your neck at regular intervals to make sure that you're doing things right. We got about just shy of 900 grand for this. Our target is 400, although we'll be able to wrap back from that a bit because the fidelity of our data capture is so good as a result of the diligence of our PRs that we're getting 100% primary outcome, which is almost unheard of. It's a very simple trial. It's a very traditional, old-school, one-to-one randomisation of women who are requesting opioid analgesia. And our endpoint, our shtick, the eureka moment, if you like, was we're looking at an endpoint which has never been investigated for remifentanil, which is the percentage progression to epidural after the intervention. There's a lot of work about whether Remi actually is an effective analgesic or not. No one yet has looked at whether there are a group of women for whom it is just enough to actually prevent them progressing to epidural. The recruiting centres so far, I think we've got about 14 running, and we've got a few more in approval. And they really represent a very, very disparate group. And this is something I find very encouraging about doing clinical research. That if you go out nationally, you get all sorts of groups. You get big tertiary hospitals like Birmingham Women's Hospital, right down to sort of fairly modestly sized units who are actually performing very well. So, in conclusion, I'm going to stand on my soapbox just for a minute or so to give you a sort of unevidence-based opinion about something. Perioperative research, in the widest sense, and intrapartum research is hard. It's really, really hard. But it is really, really important. Recruitment is hard. It's costly. You need infrastructure. You need a clinical trials unit, patient and public involvement, and if possible, research design support. But if you can do all that, it has the advantage of almost immediate external validity. Because pretty much having a baby in Leeds is the same roughly as having a baby in Hull or Sheffield or York or John Groves. What that means is if you show an intervention is relevant to women and effective, you can immediately transfer that out into national guidelines. So it's highly generalised. My soapbox, I'm climbing down from a little now. You're familiar with the Royal College NAP processes. I think they're excellent. They're highly useful for us as researchers as sources of high fidelity information. Yeah. We can go to funding bodies and say, this is what we're doing right now. There is a slight danger, I perceive, that we are going to ultimately be seen as an audit-only specialty. And if we persist down the line of NAP after NAP after NAP after NAP with nothing beyond that, that's something I think that we have to have a half an eye on. So, in conclusion, if we're to undergo a transformation from a Cinderella specialty and actually attend and be part of the party that's going to go on, I think there's a few things that need to happen. The future is not as dim as it might seem. You may be familiar with something called the James Lind Alliance, who've just undertaken a national perioperative care priority setting exercise. Many obstetric questions are up there. If you can vote, I urge you to do so. There is also the Royal College Perioperative Medicine Initiative, which you'll be familiar with. And we are right in the zone here in obstetrics. We've been doing perioperative medicine obstetrics for 20 years before anyone knew it existed, managing patients from their admission right the way through to their discharge. So all of that patient journey is relevant to you. And there's also a national review of maternity services, which is coming right now. And your organisations, including the OAA, are banging hard on the door to be in a seat at that table and actually pushing your priorities and your concerns right up the agenda. So why do we do perioperative research? Why do we do intraoperative research? In conclusion, I've completely borrowed the speech of another Irish Catholic diaspora product. We do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. We'd now like to open to the floor for questions. We have microphones at the back of the room, so if you'd like to put your hand up if anybody has questions, please, for Dr. Wilson.
Would you like me to go to the microphone?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, right, sorry. Hi, it's Simon Old York. I'd like to ask. Thank you for that. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your.
Hi, Simon Old York. Thank you for that. Ask you.
I'll speak without. Research has shown that modern microphones don't work. Anyway, one of your earlier slides quoted that 34 out of 34 hepatologists were good researchers and 1% of many thousands of anaesthetists weren't. Presumably you've got to distinguish between quality and quantity of research. You're not encouraging tens of thousands of anaesthetists to become researchers, are you?
No, and I think that's a good point. It would be unrealistic. I mean, what I was hoping to show that, and that slide was subject to the bias in that it's a National Institute of Health research funded research. So it doesn't include things like money from the OAA and national trials. What I would encourage most clinical anaesthetists to do is I hear a very great deal from my colleagues and nationally, well, I don't know anything about research and it's all too hard. And part of the idea behind the talk this morning was to show you that there is a way through, that if you have a good idea, even if it's at a local level, you can go and get even modest levels of funding, which your hospitals have to support. In terms of actually sort of the second point that you made, no, I'm not suggesting that it's practical for everyone to go and learn how to do research. But I do harbour a concern that if we don't teach the next generation that coming through our hands that it is relevant at all, there will be a bit of a scorched earth for us within 10 years, when no one will actually have the capacity to do anything.
As a personality type, anaesthetists are quite different from hepatologists. Do you think you were born a researcher, or have you been taught to be a researcher?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that I had the opportunity, the luxury, if you like, to not be subject to the sort of the very, very channel training schemes that a lot of our juniors have to actually deal with. And I had the luxury to bang around and do a lot of things before anaesthesia. I think that, in essence, I was probably a researcher first and then had to learn to be a good anaesthetist. But I do know of many of my colleagues who work with me who are quite the opposite. And there is a convergence at the end, around about, sort of a senior level, that I think you can learn to do better.
Anybody else have a good question for Dr. Wilson? I've got a question.
Yeah.
All this frightens me. I have to be honest, research absolutely frightens me. I'm from a reasonably sized DGH. I would like to get involved in multi-centre trials, and I think that would be an interesting and easier stepping stone for somebody who is black and rabbit caught in headlights on research. What would you say to somebody like me?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think what I would advise is two things. Firstly, I think the easiest way into multi-centre research for interested consultants who are perhaps, like yourself, harbour a degree of anxiety about it, is to look at whether you can take up the role of something called a principal investigator. And each study that I've mentioned has at each centre a principal investigator, which is usually a consultant anaesthetist. It is their responsibility for the study to oversee administration of that study on their site alone. Yes? So recruitment and data capture. And if it is a portfolio study, as a principal investigator, you get an enormous amount of support from your clinical research facility. So, as a chief investigator, I rely on principal investigators coming to me saying, Matt, I want to do that study, I want to bring it to York or Doncaster or Birmingham or wherever, and I'm going to be your PI. My experience of that is that I end up getting a very, very good relationship with many, many colleagues nationally. And that, if you like, is the glue that holds together these trials. The other side of it is that even if you're not research literate or research au fait, the support you get by being a PI is so good that all the answers are there and places, the people are there for you to get those answers. Does that reassure you?
More so than was before.
There you go.
But I would say we do 4,000 deliveries on one site and 2,000 deliveries on another site. Surely that's too small.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, that's the mean size of the units that we have participating in salve and respite is 6,000 in total. But the range is from 2,500 up to 8. And in fact, there is an economy of size. I'm aware we're running out of time. There's an economy of size here. That often it is the sort of more bespoke units, the units which PIs can exert a little bit more kind of personal contact that recruit very, very well. Yeah.
Okay, one more question, Matt.
Mr. Wall?
Yep.
I'm not sure whether I use it. Hi, I'm Chloe, I'm the trainee representative.
Hello.
I'm just wondering if you've got any tips for trainees who wish to get involved in research outside of the structured academic training programmes, which are small in number.
Yes. They are small in number. The academic training programmes, they do exist, but as you say, they're numerically, they don't really impinge on the major training programme. There are two ways. The first thing is, if there is a project underway at one of your centres, like one of these, yeah? Ask the PI who will be in these to be involved. Get yourself GCP trained. You heard of GCP training? Get yourself GCP trained, and be involved in recruitment and data, management. That is now a translatable thing to take on to interview. To say I've been involved in national level research. The second thing is that I think is very useful initiative is that there are locally and nationally there are now trainee networks, yes, for research. I'm thinking of training networks like Shark in Sheffield, Swarm in the southwest. And what these networks do is actually give trainees the opportunity to conglomerate and have and conduct things like audits, but not as an individual, as a group of trainees. We've used them to good effect in Sheffield for the National Laboratory Audit. They've really actually conducted that on one of our sites. And it is a good port of call to get started. If you really feel that the academic bug has bitten you, then you need to be looking at funded higher degrees. Go and talk to university representatives.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wilson.